So I think our next speaker really completes the panel very nicely, continues the discussion. Ian, please. So Ian Barker is the head of agricultural partnerships in Syngenta Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture. He has a rich experience in R&D management in plant pathology and diagnostics technology. Before joining the foundation, Ian was head of seed system for the International Potato Center, CIP, in Nairobi, improving a provision of affordable quality planting material for smallholders in developing countries. Ian chaired CIP's Public-Private Partnership Committee and has implemented innovative partnerships using private sector investments and know-how to increase the availability of quality potato and seed in East Africa. Previously, he worked on as the head of diagnostics at the UK Food and Environment Research Agency, developing and commercializing novel diagnostic methods for plants and animal diseases, as well as food seed contaminants. Ian graduated from Y College, University of London, and holds a PhD from the University of Exeter, UK. Please.
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to give you this opportunity to speak to you this morning. I didn't bring a PowerPoint presentation along. I've just written some notes. I hope that's okay. Just by way of introduction, the Syngenta Foundation is a separate legal entity from the company Syngenta. Our mission is smallholder agriculture. I probably would have liked to have brought a PowerPoint along and shown you some of the cool stuff we do, rather than talk about this rather, with due respect to previous speakers, this fairly dry subject of intellectual property, but I'm very happy to talk about. What I would have shown you in a nice PowerPoint is some of the cool stuff we do on things like smallholder insurance through and ICT approaches to extension, things like that. So if you're interested in what we do, and also another topic we mentioned, mechanisms to allow farmers to invest in their own businesses, access to credit, access to savings, how insurance can reduce that risk. That whole topic, if you're interested in what we do, please go and look at our website. So, but back to this very dry subject, but important subject of intellectual property. A previous speaker has made the case, or both our previous speakers have made the case, the importance of this subject, and an excellent introduction to the subject from the previous speaker. So I just wanted to tell you a bit of a story about the work we do in East Africa, and it's on potato seed. And I think it's always important to start with, we've heard some of the criticisms, we talk about ethics, but I think it's important to talk about the current situation. Potato farmers in East Africa, where I lived and worked, and still work for many years, do not have access to clean, quality potato seed. That means they're trapped in a cycle of low production of, say, 7 tons a hectare, when they should be getting 30 tons a hectare easily. The principal reason for this is the lack of quality seed. And that situation has been in place for 30 years. The public sector does a great job on the R&D side, but the public sector are not natural seed companies. And they've singularly failed to get seed out to farmers over that period. So less than 1% of the farmers in East African highlands have access to quality seed. So the interest to us in the Syngenta Foundation, and if we do have an ideology, it is that we feel that the private sector should play a bigger part in development, but working in public-private partnerships. So what can we do about that? So I'm responsible for the seeds program in the Syngenta Foundation, and my interest is how can we facilitate, how can we interest the private sector in investing in seeds, particularly in my case in Africa, in a wider range of crops and varieties. You made the point, they'll turn around and say, the market isn't big enough. That's the first thing they're going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you a bit about that story, about how we do work on building the market for seed. That relates to linkages to off-takers, availability of credit, insurance. The second point is that most African seed companies don't have access to their own R&D. There are some bright spots. There are some, there is maize breeding in Africa, private maize breeding, some vegetable breeding. But for the vast majority of crops, there is no access to their own private sector R&D. So a seed company in Africa really needs to look outside, to where technology might be available. And this is where intellectual property comes in. Of course, the third part of this, which I won't talk about either, is enabling policy. And it's great to hear colleagues from Ethiopia talking about the great work they're doing on building the enabling policy environment. That's the third leg of the stool that needs to be looked at. But back to introducing this, and of course Kenya is, if you're interested, a UPOV 91 member. And intellectual property cannot actually be escaped. There's two sides to this. One, if you want to produce seed in Kenya today, the first thing the seed certification agency will ask you to show them is proof from the owner that you have the right to multiply that seed. They actually enforce as well. We didn't talk about enforcement, but they actually enforce. They would take you to court if they found you. And so that's one side of this side of it. The other side of it is how do we get the private sector to get involved? And the point is, I'm trying to make, if we are serious about getting private sector investment and involvement in this, which we believe could unlock the potential of these crops, and we're talking about public bred varieties, so we're talking about the huge public investment in breeding, which is not reaching farmers. And that's what we're talking about, extending partnerships with the private sector to make sure that investment in public breeding does get to farmers. So one of the things we got involved in basically was to involve the private sector in seed potato production in Kenya. And the good news is, today, we've leveraged, I don't know, $3 million in this area to invest in private seed production. We just completed an impact study of our work where we found that one particular seed multiplier distributes now public bred potato varieties to over 15,000 smallholder farmers in Kenya and generates, we've now calculated over $6 million of additional income since 2009 to those farmers. I think that's a story, that we have to tell. Intriguingly, if you calculate the value to the seed company, which has to be profitable, it's probably only capturing about 20% of that value. So 80% of that additional value is going to the smallholder farmer. And that, we talk about ethics, I think that's, that's part of the story here that we need to tell. So the interesting part of this is then, so if you really want to, interest private sector in investing in a wider range of crops, seed production of a wider range of crops, you have to talk about intellectual property. It's something that we need to talk about. And I think the previous speaker said it really well. We need to talk about intellectual property as an enabler, not as a barrier. We have to move away from that sort of mindset. One interesting thing that we did, which your previous speaker hopefully will be equally interested in, one thing we did was to broker a partnership, a licensing agreement between a Dutch potato breeder and a Kenyan seed producer, the first of its kind. Now, why would they happy to even think about this? They're thinking about collecting royalties. Is, of course, first of all, Kenya is a UPOV member. If Kenya wasn't a UPOV member, they wouldn't be interested because they wouldn't have that. Whether you can enforce it or not is another matter. It gives them some level of confidence that it might work at least. There is at least a legal basis. But the interesting point was, and your previous speaker I hope will be interested, in brokering that licensing arrangement, we put money into this partnership. We built a marriage. We built trust between these partners. We introduced them together. We put them in a room together. We see whether there's any romance. If there is romance, which basically comes down to trust, then we take it, to another phase. And we even became a signatory to this licensing agreement, the third person in the marriage. Not always a good idea. We say that we'll leave the marriage after a number of years. But as part of us being in the marriage and investing in this partnership, we actually wrote a clause in into that licensing arrangement that the private seed breeder will waive its UPOV 91 rights to collect home-saved seed royalties off small potato seed producers. And they signed it, and I said, look, let's turn this into a positive. We have to turn this into a positive. Don't worry about what you might lose, just think about what we might gain. And so we did that, and it can be done. So just to reiterate what your previous speaker said, you can use licensing arrangements. They can be used. We equally specified that 25% of the seed should be supplied in small bags. That's the price of receiving money from us. And I take the point, why not get a government to extend this kind of thinking? It's a very good idea. So we can use licensing to engage the private sector. And I guess the good news is we hope, if it's used fairly and sensibly, that it can enable investment. And we do need investment. And we must tell these good news stories. The thing I wanted to end on was a bit about civil society. I was, fortunately or unfortunately, came to this meeting from a meeting in Berlin, which was looking at United Nations-sponsored guidelines on responsible agricultural investments. And for the first time, I wasn't really sure what I'd be coming to in this meeting. We were confronted by 2/3 of the audience being civil society, that you were less charitable about. They call themselves civil society, and to me, to be honest, it was quite a shock and quite worrying. I think we should be aware of the level of antagonism that is out there now in terms of intellectual property, but it goes much wider than that. And I was really surprised that what we were talking about this morning, the whole concept of public-private partnerships is under attack. The whole concept of private sector engagement is under attack. You mentioned Grow Africa. They specifically mentioned Grow Africa. They have Grow Africa as a specific target in their gun sights to go after. And you think, well, what do you think about this? So I just think we should be, what's the answer to this? What am I trying to say? We must tell these good news stories. If we have good news stories, Netafim, get out there. Netafim are talking to their plants. Can you persuade the plants to talk to the farmers, so the farmers can go and tell civil society that that private sector investment is not all bad. And one thing I did want to mention that was, what do we say about this? We ignore these people. We just say, we could use unkind language about them and just dismiss them. I'm not sure dismissing them is particularly a good idea, particularly as the document that led the session that I was actually in and chairing on came from, I must say, the United Nations. I won't mention which branch of the United Nations, but the official document that was guiding this whole discussion started from the premise that all private sector investment, by definition, was negative. So the idea, if we have to be slightly careful here. So I think I better finish there with just a plea that we need to get out there, assuming you all of in this room, do believe at some level that private sector investment is part of the story, and it's only part of the story, and there have to be safeguards, and we have to make sure we're doing this for the right reasons, the right motives. We're going to have to go out there, I think, and make the case. Thank you.